A few days later, Ensor made his way to Danish's main commercial docking station. It was filled with various ships of all shapes, sizes and condition. The station bustled with activity as chartered transports arrived and left in a seemingly haphazard but obviously organised manner. Ensor made his way to Hangar 73, where he saw waiting a well-maintained Type 4 mini planet hopper which could be used for transporting up to 3 people, along with a minimal amount of cargo. These ships were usually used for small space trips, so Ensor was aware the journey might not be the most luxurious he had ever experienced. However, as he was the only traveller on this flight, at least he had the passenger deck to himself for privacy and comfort. Importantly, the ship was of a type known to be reliably fast, so the journey should take no longer than a day and a half. Zedan's voice came over the intercom system installed in the hangar.
We are fueled and ready to go. The passenger entrance is open. Please get on board as we have clearance granted to leave in the next few minutes.
Zedan was indeed efficient. Payment had been processed almost immediately, and he obviously didn't want to waste any time with niceties. Ensor checked to make sure that a small device, rather like a communicator, and no bigger than his hand, was working. Ensor again decided to wear the ill-fitting clothes he had donned for the meeting with Zedan. He had enjoyed his negotiations with Kingston that had ensured there would be no interlopers with whom he would need to interact or deal with when his true destination was revealed. As promised, Zedan showed no interest in his passenger, believing him to be yet another lonely, excitement-starved technician seeking the forbidden entertainments that Space City could provide for enough credits. If the pilot had bothered to look more closely at his passenger, he might have caught the predatory intelligence that no disguise could quite hide in Ensor's pale blue eyes. But Zedan had long since lost any curiosity in his cargoes. For the jaded pilot, this was just another tedious run to Space City.
We're making good progress and are on schedule to reach Space City in 24 hours. And we'll reach Space City in 16 hours. There's some space turbulence ahead. Ensure that you and your belongings are secured. There's no cause for concern. The flight is on schedule to reach Space City in 9 hours.
Ensor spent most of the journey sleeping, or at least pretending to, and the remainder was spent apparently staring at a small reading device that he had brought with him. The passenger area was hardly spacious, but at least it had comfortable seating, which was more than adequate for one occupant. Keeping his head down, Ensor managed to maintain his harmless persona, even having thought to download a few salacious sim videos, popular with his fellow technicians, and which he had often observed them watching avidly, if surreptitiously, in their tiny, drab cubicles at work. Other than a brief, contemptuous glance at the journey progress display, Ensor paid no real attention to the lewd gyrations on the device. To him, even the pornography of Morphenial was as tedious and uninteresting as the rest of the planet, but he felt it added a bit of reality to his charade. If the pilot did happen to take notice of what Ensor was doing via the camera that allowed the pilot to monitor his passengers, Zedan would see a mild-mannered office worker engaging in the expected behaviour of the typical Space City-destined clientele. Ensor's true attention was focused on the other device of his own creation, which sat on his lap. Its function was to monitor the ship's navigation computers, which would allow him to take control of the ship when the time was right. As expected, and indeed welcomed by Ensor, the journey had been boring and uneventful, so far.
We'll begin our approach to Space City in half an hour. Make sure you don't leave anything on board when you disembark. I will advise you when you may do so.
This alerted Ensor that it was time to enact the final, hidden part of his plan. Standing up slowly, he moved with deliberate steps towards the pilot's cabin, no longer bothering to keep his head down or hide the cold determination in his eyes. Ensor now had to secure his passage to Gouda Prime, with or without Zedan's cooperation, and he knew exactly how far he would go to achieve his aim. Ensor entered a command into his small device that overrode the ship's computers. He faced the camera he knew would allow Zedan to see him, awaiting the pilot's reaction. Initially, Zidane failed to notice the tall figure now standing and staring directly into the passenger camera. Glancing briefly at the monitor, as he often did, the pilot was startled, and it began to dawn on him that the nature of his mission, which had seemed just a standard drop-off, was about to change. He saw his passenger now staring with a dispassionate gaze, no longer the shy, harmless office worker Zidane had first met. As the pilot glanced down at the control panel, startled, he realized that the ship was no longer responding to his commands. More importantly, he noticed that the coordinates on his navigation screen were no longer those he had set for the familiar approach to Space City, but were somehow new coordinates, set for a sector of space that no sane pilot ever went near. The infamous Gouda Prime blockade.
What in the hell? What do you think you're doing? Get back in your damn seat, right now!
I am taking control of your ship, or, more accurately, my ship now.
Get back in your seat. I don't know what these coordinates are, but whatever little computer game you think you're playing is no happening on my ship. I'm dropping you off at Space City, or maybe the security office there, if you don't get your ass sitting back down and stop screwing with my ship.
Slight change of plan, unfortunately. Space City is no longer on my itinerary, and this ship is now bound for Gouda Prime. You may come along, suitably restrained, of course, but you really have no choice in the matter than to cooperate. Or there is always the less pleasant option.
Gouda Prime? Are you completely insane? You're not taking my ship to Gouda Prime. You'll never get through the blockade, man.
Zidane stared furiously at the screen.
Incorrect. I will get through the blockade. And just so we are clear, I am going to Gouda Prime in what is now my ship. And I no longer need you to pilot this vehicle. So please, choose your next words carefully.
Your ship? I still don't know what trick you're pulling, but this is my ship, and it's not going anywhere near Gouda Prime. I'm having your ass arrested as soon as we land.
Zidane tried desperately to sound as if he was still in command and not paralyzed with fear. Ensor could hear banging as the furious pilot began smashing the control panels in front of him with his fists, desperately trying to get back control of the ship, or at least disable the new flight path. Realizing that in his frenzy Zidane might damage the ship, Ensor entered one last command into his device and stared coldly at the camera.
It would appear you have made your choice. A regrettable one, but your decision nonetheless.
The pilot looked at the cold eyes staring at the camera. An unfamiliar sense of panic, not felt since his early days of flight training, began to creep into Zidane's mind, and he reached for the gun he always kept under his seat. As he did so, Zidane started to feel lightheaded and began having difficulty pulling enough oxygen into his lungs. As consciousness began to fade, he slowly fell forward on the console, the gun slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the floor. Ensor walked back to his seat and patiently waited for the lack of oxygen to render the pilot inoperative. He regretted his course of action, but felt there really had been no other way to achieve his goal once Zidane had made his stand against him. Ensor felt he had given Zidane a more than fair choice, and that it was not his fault if the stubborn man chose foolishly. In a rare moment of introspection, Ensor waited to see what he would feel, whether remorse or triumph at overcoming normal human scruples about the taking of another's life. He was somewhat surprised to find that he felt very little other than slight distaste at having to resort to activities usually perpetrated by the sort of common criminal he typically looked down on. If anything, Ensor felt relieved that he had been able to gain control of the ship so easily, and could now concentrate on the task at hand, safely reaching Gouda Prime and finding Aurak. Once it was safe, he let himself into the pilot's control room, ignoring Zedan's slumped form.
Identify yourself with your codes, or leave Gouda Prime space.
The authoritative voice boomed over the ship's communication system. Ensor stared at his handheld device and called up the codes he had received from Aurak. He looked at the small screen impassively for a moment, knowing that if this was all a hoax and these codes were not legitimate, then it was highly likely the authorities' ships would simply open fire, even if he retreated. He smirked and decided to be as short and authoritative as the GP official had been.
Authorization code is Zulu 47 Romeo Echo 9 Kilo Sierra 37.
Ensor's response was slow, clear, and confident. There was a pause of a minute or so as the control station processed the codes. This interval stretched beyond that which he deemed necessary, and Ensor's smirk faded. He brushed away a traitorous bead of sweat from his brow, just as the communication system once again gave out a short, shrill beep, indicating an incoming message.
Authorization is granted for you to land in and access Plantation 12, and Plantation 12 only. If you ignore these restrictions, a law enforcement officer may instantly terminate you. Your authorization is for 24 hours only. If your ship is still on Gouda Prime at that point, it will be embargoed. To leave Gouda Prime space, you will need to give your exit codes or your ship will be destroyed. Proceed to Plantation 12 using the coordinates we have sent to your ship's computer.
Ensor let out a sigh of relief and shifted his attention to the flight console. The screen displayed some coordinates, so the codes had clearly worked. He pressed a switch next to the display, and the ship changed direction, starting its descent towards the planet below. Ensor strapped himself into the flight seat and was relieved when the handheld device advised him that the automatic landing computer was online and fully functional. He trusted computers exponentially more than sentient beings, particularly humans, and this confirmation allowed him to relax and focus. As he did so, Ensor noticed Zedan's gun on the floor. With a grim smile, he reached down and picked it up. At least he was now armed, should anything unpleasant greet him on the surface. The well-maintained planet hopper approached the mostly forested surface of Gouda Prime, and as Ensor had hoped, the landing program managed the descent and touchdown smoothly. Observing the efficient way the ship's computer easily located an appropriate area to land in Plantation 12 among all the greenery, it was obvious to Ensor that he had researched and picked his choice of transport wisely, along with the practicality of eliminating the planet hopper's original owner. The computer was proving to be more accurate and much less troublesome than the pilot would have been. Ensor looked at the temperature reading and noticed that he was not appropriately dressed. He quickly unzipped Zedan's grey, puffer-style jacket, removing it from the corpse with no more emotion than if the dead body had been a mannequin, and donned the coat after discarding his flimsier jacket. Ensor attached Zedan's gun to the clip on the side of the jacket, put on some gloves he found next to the flight station, and picked up his handheld device. Now he felt more prepared, and walked over to the ship's exit. After a momentary pause to steady nerves that he didn't want to acknowledge, he activated the door, which hummed open, the automatic steps extending down to the surface outside. Ensor inspected the handheld device, which displayed directions and distance to the rendezvous. Fortunately, not a long trek, at just over a mile. Deciding there was no point in being here any longer than necessary, Ensor bounded down the steps in 2 long strides and started running. Ensor noticed his device picking up other transport in the vicinity. It read as a ship and a ground vehicle of some kind. plus 3 lifeform signals, although enough distance away not to worry him at present. 2 of the lifeforms seemed to be travelling together, with the other not far away, but moving slowly in his direction. Ensor began to move faster. He didn't want to find out who these people were. He simply wanted to reach Aurak, make the pickup, and get away from this planet. When he reached the coordinates, Ensor looked around in frustration. He could see nothing obvious to indicate the whereabouts of Aurak, and was painfully aware of being completely out in the open, in the middle of a now flat and sparsely vegetated area. Somewhere in the distance, Ensor could see a few disused, burnt-out buildings that looked as if they probably continued underground. Anxiety was beginning to nag at him when the communication channel unexpectedly opened on his device. He had not opened the channel, but a voice came through, irascible sounding, rather like a short-tempered school headmaster.
Zek Ensor, it is logical that you should find me first.
Aurak, I assume that is you. Where are you, and what do you mean, find you first?
Well, of course it is me. I have been buried approximately 2 meters directly beneath where you stand since I was left here by Kerr Avon. But first you should know I have sent signals to multiple emergency contacts I have tracked down over the decades, as my prime directive was placed in jeopardy.
What prime directive, and is it in jeopardy?
Of course it is, or you would not have been contacted. Now hurry up and begin digging.
What is your prime directive, Aurak?
If you must know, it is not to fall into the hands of the Federation, who has tracked my location and are on their way. Now please, cease any further unnecessary communication and hasten your digging.
The supercomputer's tone became noticeably more agitated. Ensor thought again of the other transports and life forms in the area. Perhaps they were Federation. While he was not currently wanted by the Federation, he knew explaining his presence here would be exceedingly awkward, if not potentially harmful to his person. Glaring in annoyance, he thought about all the technology he had, when all he really wanted was a spade. Ensor looked around for something to use, but to no avail. He then glanced at the gun clipped to his side, decided the rather large barrel would have to do, and started vigorously loosening the ground beneath him with the weapon. Crude as it was effective. Motivated by a sense of increasing urgency, Ensor got down on his hands and knees and dug frantically with the barrel of the weapon and his bare hands, like a dog digging excitedly for a deeply buried bone. After what seemed like hours, but in reality was about 15 minutes, the barrel of the gun hit something that sounded like plastic. Ensor scraped away a layer of earth and could see flashing lights set within a clear, lucite casing. He scraped away more earth, finally laying eyes on it, exactly as his grandfather's old designs depicted, a rather ugly and awkward box of various lights with a plastic ball-like structure in the centre that could almost be the device's brain. The activation key was intact, meaning Aurak had been left switched on all these years, hidden underground and confined within the safety of its earthen cocoon, whilst gathering information and probing computer systems from a myriad of planets to feed its insatiable appetite for knowledge. The soil was now loose enough to allow Aurak to be pulled from the ground, and Ensor was surprised to find it lighter than he thought. Then Aurak spoke, its voice imperious and surprisingly querulous for a machine allegedly devoid of all human emotions.
Now, you must take me away from Gouda Prime as quickly as possible. I assume you have a ship, and I have provided the necessary codes.
Yes, I do, but first a few conditions before I liberate you, Aurak. You must immediately stop sending your location to whoever else it is you've alerted to your existence, or I will leave you here at the mercy of whoever finds you next. Your choice, of course, but I'm sure you can quickly calculate the most advantageous course of action.
Oh, very well. I have stopped sending my location. Now kindly proceed with the matter at hand and take me off this planet.
Ensor looked at his handheld device, which confirmed Aurak had stopped sending its locator signal. He adjusted the device to show the location of the ship and then set off. This time, Ensor decided to move a little more warily, the 3 lifeforms he had detected too close for a non-stealthy retreat, though still in 2 groups and some way apart. Ensor deduced that this meant they were not Federation. and that logically, even though Aurak had stopped sending its signal, one or all of them were moving in on the original locator fix. Suddenly, one of the life forms he was tracking appeared, almost catching him off guard. Ensor ducked down behind some bushes and watched a young, athletic female also take cover behind some bushes within 50 meters of where he had retrieved Aurak. She looked to be in her late 20s, and though not glamorously dressed, was obviously not from a deprived background, wearing a green, close-fitting jacket, black leggings, and ankle-length black boots. Her hair was brown, with hints of auburn, and scraped back into a ponytail. Attractive, but not really his type, Ensor thought arrogantly. Too earnest and wholesome, the kind that, in his experience, became too easily attached. He considered opening fire, but overt, precipitous attacks were not really his style. Instead, he liked to weigh up the odds before deciding on his next move. The young woman may or may not be armed, a trained Federation officer, or a bounty hunter, and he didn't fancy his chances against either. Ensor watched the other two life forms approach the female. Then he saw two men, one tall with curly, greying hair, wearing green cargo-type trousers, black boots, and a dark brown, heavily padded leather jacket. The other looked rather more dishevelled, balding, and with heavy stubble, rather sloppily attired, in a heavy, pale blue and very worn oversized jacket, dark brown trousers, and ankle-length brown boots. Both were armed, and they drew their weapons, obviously engaging disagreeably with the female. This was the perfect diversion to allow him to get away, and, seizing the opportunity, Ensor picked up Aurak, swiftly but stealthily turning to make his way back towards his stolen ship.